Welcome. You are watching episode 157 of Regional Wrap, pre-recorded on Tuesday, the 28th of January. Regional Wrap providing an insight on the issues affecting regional Australia and giving a voice to regional residents. My name is Bill Bates, and joining me on this episode, Debt Reckoning, drawing closer with every election promise, is my guest, Saxon Davidson. Saxon is a research fellow at the Institute of Public Affairs, focusing on government regulation, worker shortage, and government spending. He has a Bachelor of Arts from the University of Melbourne, majoring in politics. Saxon is a regular contributor to the public debate, having written articles published in numerous newspapers, as well as Sky News Online and The Spectator, while being a guest on many various radio and television opinion programs. He feels most strongly about liberty, freedom of speech, and the Australian way of life, and how these values have declined rapidly due to the government's policy during the COVID-19 pandemic. Part of Saxon's research at the API involves touring regional Australia to gain first-hand knowledge and evidence of the impact of centralised red tape has on the regions, and how this has created the disconnect between inner city governments who make the laws and the mainstream Australians in the region who have to comply with them. He has visited and met with people in over 60 regional towns across every state as part of this program over the past 2 years, and has used those tours to inform his analysts of various policy matters, including regional worker shortages. Saxon is currently concerned about Australia's economic and fiscal future in both the short and long term, with the per capita recession and an unsustainable debt level at both the federal and state level, especially in Victoria, weighing heavily on his assessment. He is hoping that whoever wins the government in this year's federal election realigns the budgeting process away from the last 2 decades of deterioration. Welcome, Saxon.
Thank you for having me, Bill. Looking forward to having a good chat about Australia's debt future and debt present and past, and what steps can be taken to really address these issues.
Well, the other thing is, obviously you're concerned about Victoria, and it has headlined for some time the debt that's been accumulated in Victoria, and especially the controversy over the suburban rail loop, which continues to add to the debt every day. But we've just had a bit of a breakthrough up here, an announcement from the new LNP government with assessment where the debt level is here, and they're forecasting that we'll actually surpass Victoria's debt level in about 2026, up to the tune of $217 billion of debt. So I think we've got a bigger problem than just Victoria.
Well, absolutely. And I mean, with Queensland in mind, what was really masking the current spending levels and the forecasted debt levels in Queensland was the sort of arbitrary royalty levels that were put up by the previous government under Stephen Miles and Palaszczuk, but they were unsustainable royalty levels that sort of masking the levels of government spending that had grown under the previous government. And because they were unsustainable, it obviously wasn't going to last forever. And the current levels of government spending in Queensland are therefore non-sustainable. And that's why the forecasted debt levels are so high. We had been warning about this for the past year or two, but they had fallen on deaf ears. And now the LNP have just rocked up into government and now have this massive debt balloon that they have to pop eventually and reduce down.
Well, in some ways, I haven't got much sympathy for the LNP because when they ran the election, they were promising just as much as the ALP. They are backing the continuation of 50-cent fares forever and other spending issues. Their general low target strategy not to sort of differentiate themselves so much from the LNP that they became a target. That included things like somewhat in regards to the handover Indigenous of lands and things like that. So they weren't really putting themselves out there in regards to a principled situation. And that's concerning because this debate's bringing you onto the show was instigated from your article in regards to the mid-year economic and fiscal outlook. Now, I'll just put up a slide if I can.
Of course.
Now, this, if you can see that, this is the forward of that outlook. And it's quite interesting. The mid-year economic and fiscal outlook 2024-25 has been prepared in accordance with the government's Charter of Budget Honesty Act 1998, which requires the government to provide a mid-year budget report that provides an update on information on the government's position. Now, in regards to honesty, I'm concerned because I've gone through and read a little bit. All right, we can probably verify the figures in that as to honesty, but I wonder if that also implies in regards to the narrative they fix around some of these things, because it talked about, heading for a soft landing. It also indicated that they were going to get inflation under control. So do you think maybe there has to be a little bit more scrutiny in regards to the narrative that they fix around the figures?
100% there has to be more scrutiny about how they look at the figures and how they calculate these things. You only have to look at the immigration numbers in every budget that the Albanese government has produced and in every MYEFO that the Albanese government has produced. They have been off calculation by like tens of thousands every single time, every single budget, every single MYEFO. Obviously, there has to be scrutiny on these figures, but ultimately, a lot of these projections are just that. They're projections. They can't predict every single output and input that is going to impact the figures in each MYEFO. But you do have to take at least some of them with a grain of salt and sort of just observe what's going on a day-to-day figure. What I do believe, though, is that the debt is going to increase, as was predicted by this MYEFO. Now, whether it's going to increase by exactly I've got the figure, 143 billion over the forward estimates over the next few years, over the next 4 years, we'll have to find out. But I do think that'll increase by at least that much if the Albanese government were to win government. It may even increase by more if they are forced to be a minority government with either the Teals or the Greens, with the litany of spending promises on net zero issues and educational issues that those two different sets of independents and the Greens are running on. So I think that a lot of the MYEFO is hopeful spending, especially because it's less than 6 months out from an election. But we'll have to wait and see about whether they are true or not. But they should be scrutineered well into the future, especially as we head into the next budget and to the next election.
There's a lot of commentary on regards to recession, although we technically haven't been in a recession in the normal terms, but the big conversation is a per capita recession, which basically means our Ponzi mass immigration scheme is propping up the economy and also allows governments to poorly manage the economy because they know that they can keep bringing immigrants to prop up that economy.
You're absolutely correct. The Australia's mass immigration program has been a clear failure over the past 2.5 years since the election of the Albanese government. It's about 1.12 net new migrants into the country over the past 2 years. We are in a per capita recession. The economy is basically being propped up by the new migrants and also by government spending over the previous 2.5 years. Australians under this per capita recession are about $4,300 worse off per annum under the Albanese government than they were under the previous coalition government due to this per capita recession. And Anthony Albanese is on track at the moment, unless there is a big reversal in the decline in per capita GDP, to be the only government since Federation to have a net reduction in GDP per capita since being elected for a full term if he wins again later this year. So it's been a complete disaster. Australians at the individual level are experiencing declining living standards. And there's no indication that this will reverse, especially since we're heading into election season. It's only going to be promised increased spending after promised increased spending, as we saw with the Queensland election last year. And there's no reason for the Albanese government to actually deliver on reducing immigration levels. And I don't see that they will, regardless of what happens after the election.
I think the mass immigration Ponzi scheme, as I call it, has been around for a fair while. It really started after the GFC and Rudd. We went through the problems of the GFC in about 2007, 2008. It really hit home going into 2009. And that's when the migration intake really rocketed ahead. It had sort of been stable under Howard, somewhere around between 70 and 95,000 people per annum net immigration. That quickly rocketed up, and I think we were approaching 300,000 by 2010, and it continued. It did wind back a little bit under Abbott, but then it just continued to sort of be fairly high. And even before Albanese got in, it was still far too high for the Australia to absorb. But this post-COVID, which had slowed it down, COVID had slowed it down, but post-COVID, the doors just opened and the floods came in, and we're like I say, we're seeing in the last couple of years more than 1 million people land on our doorstep, all wanting housing, all needing education. At least their children, they need health services, they need accommodation, and we're just not equipped for the situation.
Yeah, you're exactly right. We don't have the infrastructure at the moment required to help all these migrants. And not only does it help these new migrants, but also help Australians who are here already. We weren't well equipped immediately after the pandemic to take in 1 million net new migrants over 2 years of time. And I mean, everybody loses from this. The only winners are the economists at Treasury and the government, who get to say immigration is growing the economy. But this mass migration program doesn't help the new migrants, because there's all of a sudden a shortage of resources and of infrastructure. It doesn't help Australians who are here with the housing. And also it hasn't helped businesses. Our worker shortage issues have continued to persist, even though 1 million net new migrants over the past 2 years. Yet our worker shortages continue to persist around the 340, 350,000 job vacancy mark. So really, there have been no winners from this policy, and it has been an economic and societal disaster up to this point.
I think the other thing is the open doors we've got and the migrants that come in, including the ones who come in under refugee status and family reunions. A good portion of them are not great contributors to the economy. That they lack a lot of skills to join the workforce. They don't have a high emphasis on assimilating with Australian values and that. So all these problems are just wound into the immigration policy.
Yeah, they do. And this also brings in another aspect, which is the social cohesion aspect of immigration as well. Our immigration policies have worked in the past when they have met 3 key metrics. It must have the consent of the community. It must be planned for, like i.e., infrastructure, housing, health services, and it must generate an overall benefit to the economy. It must stimulate economic growth, not just at the gross level, but also at the individual level. And it's failed on all 3 counts. 60% of Australians would pause migration, not just reduce it, but pause migration if they could, according to IPA polling. We obviously do not have the housing and other related infrastructure services available, hence all the shortages and the increase in prices for a lot of our services. And also, the jobs aren't being filled, and we're, as we've been discussing, a per capita recession. And we've seen a lot of social cohesion problems in various parts of Melbourne and also Sydney, and also on our university campuses in regards to a myriad of international issues. Yeah, it's just been a failure all around at the moment.
I think one of the other problems too, although we can be financial poorer out of this, we're also amenity poorer and infrastructure poorer and services poorer. And that's sort of a hard sort of measurement to measure because it affects people differently in different areas. I mean, in a lot of cases, people in the inner city probably don't see a lot of that issue. They've still got their big hospitals, they've still got their ambulance services, and they've still got all those sort of things there. But regional Australia, it's got a different sort of dynamic in that, and it can be, we've already seen, even before this got to be a big problem, we're seeing regional towns lose things like maternity service and other services and that. And now we're even facing things like shortages of doctors. People can't get appointments. So the quality of life is also got poorer in these regards, and they don't seem to have any method of fixing those issues.
No, they don't. But what we've seen recently, particularly with the political class, and this hasn't just been an Anthony Albanese problem, this was a problem that predates him as well, is that I found that there's a lot of policy creativity at the moment at the head government level in regards to the really deep thinking. That's how we resulted in a lot of the lockdowns and the pandemics. There was a real lack of policy sort of ideals at the state and the federal government. Oh, we'll just lock them down. We'll listen to a bureaucrat that just says, I'll lock it down. It's the only thing we've been doing. And this has sort of seeped in today's government as well. I've actually really found that the fact that the only sort of ideas they've got to fix the economic woes, not just in the inner cities, but obviously in regional Australia, is to just increase spending, which is fueling a lot of the inflationary issues and the cost of living issues that people have been living with. And then also just increase migration, which is fueling a lot of the societal issues that we've been talking about today. So I don't actually think there's a lot of ideas that are coming out of Canberra at the moment that aren't just the same things which aren't just the same things package wrapped as something different, which hurts people because we need ideas to come from our political leaders to improve the lives of everybody. And it's leaving everybody behind at the moment.
I think one of the biggest things that have come out since COVID and during COVID is the propensity of politicians to hide behind expert opinion rather than have adhere to their own principles and values in regards to their party or whatever. And that's the true of Morrison and so. I mean, one of the most one of the strangest things I found about COVID is if you go back to when Abbott was the health minister and also during his short term as prime minister, there was a big effort to develop a pandemic plan, and we actually had one. Yet here's something we developed for our country using our experts and basically bipartisan support for them. And that was the first thing that was dumped in the bin. So it's quite alarming that politicians no longer stand out front shouldering responsibility. They quickly step behind some expert to tell the story.
Yeah, and I mean, everybody gets left behind by that. It's not a democratic process. You're just trusting the opinion of a lifelong bureaucrat who doesn't have any real sense of the lived experience of people's world because they've lived off the taxpayer for a large portion of their professional career. They don't know what it's like to own a business or start a business or work in a small business. And therefore, that level of thinking doesn't apply to the decisions that they make on behalf of everybody, especially if a politician is going to just willfully obey their policy ideals. And then if they don't have that perspective in mind, obviously those people that are living in that world are going to get left behind. And it just completely stopped the economy flat. Victoria still hasn't really recovered from the pandemic, and we are currently paying off extra levels of debt because that was accrued because of the non-stop lockdowns that occurred over the space of 2 years. There are still businesses that have never recovered. Some businesses closed forever. Other businesses haven't been able to get their customers to come back. And obviously we've still got a large portion of the workforce, including public servants, who are working from home, not contributing to the overall economy, not getting that coffee from the local coffee shop near work, not buying lunch in the city. And therefore the overall economic output of the state has remained stagnant, remained low. And this is a big issue for the government, that if they want to pay off the debt, because a lot of the money that they come in through is through business taxes, which are the highest in the country and the most numerous in the country. The economy stopped flat during 2020 and 2021, and it hasn't really recovered. And all because some public health bureaucrat, a nameless public health bureaucrat working under people like Brett Sutton, who was advising Daniel Andrews at the time, said so, that this was the best thing to do, even if they were a full-time, entirely professional public servant.
I think the other problem was the fact that they put out these chief health officers to the front of the media every day and espouse the direction we're going, but they never provide the documentation that they base this on, and we've never seen it. So that's all what sticks in the craw of a lot of people. But moving on in regards to the economic impact, like you say, Victoria hasn't got over the situation, especially Melbourne City itself. I mean, like you say, it's a bit of a no-go zone sort of thing in regards to the economic activity, especially for small businesses. And it's fairly similar in a lot of townships that relied on tourism and that. They've had difficulty coming back. Places like Cairns, where I am, is one of the things we're still trying to get our international visitors up. The domestic has improved somewhat, but I think the level of spending is a big problem. Where we're poorer is our discretionary spending. People say the government sort of crows that we've increased wages in real terms, but I'd like to argue that in regards to the disposable income, people have got to do the things that move the economy and keep it grinding away. I mean, paying your electricity bill doesn't actually, overly contribute to the economy. It just either goes to some power company who sends the profits overseas, or goes to the government coffers in the case of Ergon in Queensland. So that's one of the big problems, is how do we get this disposable income up to a level that people actually are helping the economy churn and burn?
Well, the first step is to tame inflation and tame underlying inflation. That's how to get people's real disposable income up. Because, I mean, there are two main thoughts in economics. The centre-right tend to believe that taming inflation is the most important aspect, whereas the left, and particularly Labour-focused left, think of employment. I mean, and that makes sense. They're the party of unions. They believe that employment is the most important aspect of the economy. It's back to that sort of Keynesian economics theories, whereas the right thinks that inflation is the most important aspect. And in my opinion, inflation is the most important aspect, is because if you're temporarily unemployed, that will hurt for the time being, but you can always find another job. Whereas inflation destroys people's livelihoods and destroys people's savings progressively over time. And if that's not tamed and it's allowed to run riot, then people's entire livelihoods are just gone. So getting people's real disposable income up is entirely reliant on getting inflation down. Because if inflation goes down, then people have more disposable income to spend on their their out of work activities, spending money in the economy, and allowing for businesses to grow. Now, one of the biggest underlying inputs into inflation at the moment is obviously government spending. The Albanese government is averaging about $70 billion of spending per quarter at the moment. That's about 50% higher than the previous government per quarter pre-COVID, so not including 2020 to 2021 to early 2022 spending. But so 50% higher than the previous government prior to COVID in non-COVID times means that, that extra money has to go somewhere. And if they're borrowing that money, that means that debt's only going to increase. And the government always points to, oh, but we delivered 2 years of surplus in a row. That surplus is entirely due to a boom in resource prices. It's not actually due to any sort of financial management from the government itself. So the government need to cut back on spending to help underlying inflation go down. And if underlying inflation starts to go down, that way people have more money and more valuable money to spend on things that they like to do outside of work and outside of amenities and outside of rent or mortgage or power bills or water bills. Things that are non-necessities that can increase their quality of life, basically.
I think one of the other things too is the Albanese government crowed fairly early and also put into action policies to lift the minimum wage and give pay rises and things like that. But we're talking about like the Ponzi scheme of migration doesn't help. Well, it also doesn't help people getting a pay rise if there's no productivity gain. Wage rises without productivity gain is just inflation. It won't take too long. It will take a couple of spends of money to roll through the thing for that impact to come on, because business, they have to pass on those costs. So if the wage cost goes up, and wages in Australia are really one of the highest items to any business cost. It probably used to be, going back some time, actual equipment and things like that, and the materials for making stuff. But there's no doubt with so many service industries and even the intensity in regards to all the conditions under labour hire for manufacturing that wages have become such a huge portion. So if they go up and no productivity, it's just inflationary.
Yeah, you're absolutely right. Not helping with the inflation is also Australia's worker shortage crisis. That's productivity going missing if businesses just cannot find the workers they need to produce the output that is required. And if that combined with the mandatory wage increases and the extra union powers that have been given in through the restriction onto labour hire and also to the various other industrial relation changes that have occurred, particularly in the first half of the Albanese government's term, it just means that my apologies. It just means that productivity remains low, and it has remained low. It remains stagnant at the moment for the last 4 or 5 years, partially due to pandemic, but we're well past that now. So productivity growth is low, but the cost of doing business is getting higher and higher. And it's not helped by the fact that energy prices continue to go higher because energy is becoming less secure because of net zero. And also because, if energy prices increases for business, it increases the prices for what you buy. It obviously increases your energy bills at home. It means that prices just continue to go up. And it's not going to go down unless severe realignments occur at the policy level in the government.
Well, there's a couple of other things too in regards to, we've always had for some time a realisation that costs of building infrastructure and also big commercial buildings and things like that is somewhere between 30 and 40% higher than in other developed countries and that. I think that's pretty well accepted. And I think the recent policies in the last 18 months, 2 years, has exacerbated that to an extent that, we talk about a project being costed, at $12 billion, but uh, before the final drawings and decision of funding comes into it, it's doubled sort of thing without, and we haven't even put a spade in the ground. Uh, and that's completely nonsensical. And the other thing is, we've also had a government that's crowed about its employment figures, the growth in employment. But I think one of your points was that more than 70% of growth in employment is in the non-productive public sector that doesn't produce anything, creates no wealth, and only is basically a black hole for taxpayers' money.
Yeah. Well, on the construction sector part, being from Melbourne myself, I know all about the blowouts that can occur in the construction sector, particularly with government jobs. I mean, in Victoria, I'm pretty sure the person that holds the stop-go sign earns north of six figures in Victoria for construction sites. But with the growth of employment, I mean, you're correct. A large portion of the growth of employment have been in the non-productive sectors, the public service and the services sector. It doesn't create any wealth, and it is at a massive cost to the Australian people, the taxpayer. I mean, the NDIS has become basically a black hole for funds to just where it increases and increases in expenditure. And I mean, I know that Bill Shorten made a big, tried to get some reforms through, but they weren't systemic reforms to the NDIS or its formation. And I mean, I imagine a lot of those reforms will be reversed if the Greens get to be in co-governance with the Labor Party after the next election. So, I mean, the growth of employment has been in the services sector and in the public service. And in Victoria, the cost of building anything has been growing. I mean, we were talking like earlier about the suburban rail loop. So much of it's hard to get people in the construction industry to work on building homes because they just get to earn so much more working on government projects such as the suburban rail loop. And because it creates a scarcity in building homes, that obviously increases the price of getting to build them because they build more slowly, there's less workers to work on them, and everything just gets more expensive. So yeah, there has to be a real shift in how that operates. Unfortunately, the Victorian election isn't for a while, I think almost 2 years away, where people can voice their displeasure about how things have been going. Although, I mean, people have had the same government here for 11, 12 years and they haven't voiced any real want for change. But the Albanese government has not proven to be a well-rounded and for policy-wise government. And I don't see a changing track in order to meet the immediate demands required to shift. Because I don't think they view a lot of these problems as issues. I don't think if you asked a Labor minister at the moment if they viewed the unsustainable increase to the public service or to the services sector as inflationary, I think they'd just deny that it was. So I don't think there's going to be any shift for a while on these fronts.
Well, I think the other thing is you grow the public service, you grow the number of people depending on the taxpayer's wage, and therefore you have a bigger number of actual workers and their family who are going to support Labor to ensure that growth and that continues. So it's also a bit like why we're having high immigration is because to a degree, people who have got their foot in the door here are sort of happy to sort of align with Labor values and get more of their family in. So it's a bit of a election sort of guaranteeing the vote sort of thing as we move through for Labor.
Well, the public service angle is interesting because, I mean, public servants, as we saw with the Voice to Parliament vote, are completely out of touch, at least in Canberra, with how Australians view the world outside of the ACT. The ACT was the only territory / state to vote yes at the referendum. They were also, I'm pretty sure they were the only territory slash state to vote yes for a republic back in 1999. They're completely out of step with the views of the community on a myriad of social issues. And obviously, they're going to view the world differently because, again, as we said with the COVID pandemic example, they don't actually, a lot of people in Canberra working in the public service don't have that experience or perspective of the private sector in any capacity. So it really does sort of jar their views regarding,
Well, not
how
only
the
that, I
community
mean,
views
it
it.
is always been a Canberra bubble, but I think that bubble has almost developed its own um, dome of steel defense against opinion, sort of thing. The sort
Yeah,
of you've got
no,
to be of the same voice, other than, or else you're not going to work well in the bubble in the public service.
well, this is why I was fairly excited to hear that Senator Jacinta Price had been appointed the Shadow Minister for Government Efficiency, following the sort of government efficiency department that President Trump has set up with Elon Musk. That there is going to be an effort made, if the coalition win the next government, to make the government more efficient, push out pen pushers from Canberra, you know, get rid of the people in the bureaucrats in Canberra who are simply just there to regulate the private sector. There are over, by the end of financial year this year, there will be over 100,000 bureaucrats in Canberra whose sole job is to burden the private sector with red tape. That's far too high. 100,000 people whose only job there is to regulate the private sector under a myriad of red and green tape, our most productive industries. And particularly because this government has been openly hostile to our most productive industries, those being mining and agriculture, particularly industries that are heavily located in regional Australia. You know, we saw that the nature positive laws got pushed down the barrel. Albanese has not committed to scrapping them altogether like he did with the misinformation laws. But what we do know is that if the Greens and the Teals do get into minority government with Anthony Albanese, that the nature positive rules won't just be coming back; they'll also be coming back with sharper teeth. You know, a climate trigger which will cancel any project over 100,000 metric tons of emissions, of carbon emissions. You know, it'll also come in with potentially the end of the logging industry nationwide. You know, methane emission regulations. Cane farmers in Queensland will be particularly impacted, I believe, with the fertiliser regulations. Basically, a duplication with already exists at the Queensland state level. Our, you know, gas, coal, iron ore, nickel, a lot of our big export mining operations will face a lot more heavy regulations that they already do, even though red tape is already at a record high across the country. There's a lot of efficiency that needs to be that needs to be imposed onto Canberra and how things are run and how they actually run the country. And I'm excited if that prospect does go ahead. And also if they get any tips from the US to see how they are going under President Trump and Elon Musk with the Department of Government Efficiency. We need a sharp reduction in red tape. And we need it now because otherwise the bubble is just going to grow. And it's going to grow and grow and it's going to absorb us all. And, you know, it's just going to become a sort of public servant paradise where the taxpayers' money just increasingly and increasingly goes to the government.
I think the other thing that's happened too is just going back to the voice referendum. It has given ordinary people a voice to comment more openly and freely. I don't think the government or opposition has really picked up on that enough. kudos to Dutton for bringing in Jacinta Price into the an area of the ministry where she's got a bigger overview just than the Indigenous portfolio on that, and hopefully that goes into the future. But one of the things that I think that we don't get enough recognition for is the regional's contribution into the result of the voice. I mean, there's a lot of commentators. I hear Sky News commentators banging on all the time. I saw it at CPAC banging on about the 60% voting no and that. Well, if it wasn't for regional Australia and a lot of those electorates voting 70, 80%, if you just left it to the seats around Sydney, Melbourne, Brisbane, Perth, and Adelaide and that vote would have been somewhere down in the low 50s. It would have got over the line. It's only that the regions delivered those 80% plus electorates made the big difference, and where people can speak confidently about, it won by a good margin. But like I say, we're not getting the kudos, and we're also not getting the focus. But the regions are the heartland of conservatism and common sense. Yet people like Dutton are still mucking around on the sidelines in regards to investing in the regions. I mean, we've just had him come up here a couple of days ago into Cairns and talk about another $7 billion of loan funding and that. Well, as we move, this year is the 10th anniversary of the Abbott's White Paper on Northern Development. Now, nothing has happened in Northern Australia. There's been no major projects of any consequences that have delivered wealth creation. Another loan facility, I don't know, people may welcome it or not, but it's not going to deliver infrastructure that we need for us, government infrastructure and public infrastructure. It might help some businesses get off the ground, but that's it. So I think there's got to be investment, like from the conservative side of think tanks pushing for it, also the government itself, that the focus as we move forward has to be on wealth curation. That used to be a focus of government, one time to actually create wealth rather than just buy votes. So as we go into this election cycle, just how much will it impact with every promise that is sort of put across either by Labor or Liberal going into this? If there's $1 billion here and $1 billion there, how do we see? Would it be good to have a sort of a meter, a ticking over meter with every promise? You can see the debt go up.
Well, they had that back in the US back in the day. I think it was Paul Ryan had that under Obama about how much money being spent attributes to the debt. I remember that back in the day. But with regional Australia, you're absolutely right about regional Australia carrying in large portion the no vote. We had places like in Maranoa having close to 80% no, obviously in regional Queensland, regional Western Australia. Melbourne was a big hub for the yes vote. It wouldn't be for the outer suburbs and the regions in Victoria carrying the no vote down here. And you're right, the regional Australia absolutely is the heartland at the moment. Regional Australia sort of represents a big tension between the coalition at the moment, especially when in regards to emission reduction policies and net zero, and the sort of green tape areas that does limit the wealth creation in regional Australia, particularly when you do have a lot of Liberals who are brought up in inner city Melbourne or inner city Sydney or in inner city Brisbane. Compared that with a lot of the Nationals from Queensland to Victoria as well, and as well as the regional seats in New South Wales and Victoria that has Liberals. There is that sort of tension between the two and trying to find that balance. And that balance was really offset after Scott Morrison announced that he was adopting the net zero policy at the end of 2021. Regional Australians were really left behind in that decision. And I think that the pendulum needs to swing back a little. We need to drop net zero, not only, for a myriad of macroeconomic reasons and because of, our export markets and for our trade relations with partners such as Japan and South Korea, but because the jobs that net zero destroys aren't in the areas of the country of the people who want it most. The jobs that net zero destroys, the places where the jobs that net zero destroys are in regional Australia. It's in Rocky. It's in Kingaroy. It's in Mount Isa. It's in regional WA. It's in the Goldfields. It's in the Pilbara and the Kimberley. It's in the Northern Territory. It's not in Melbourne. It's not in Canberra. It's not in Sydney, and it's not in Brisbane. So I think that tension, the pendulum of that tension, does need to swing back a bit. I mean, you've seen at the moment that the Albanese government is flouting their Future Made in Australia policy. That's apparently going to bring manufacturing jobs back to the regions. I mean, it's simply not. It's based off the Inflation Reduction Act in the United States under President Biden. But IPA research found when we were doing our submission to that for every job that Future Made in Australia will make to 2030, about 8 jobs are going to be destroyed from net zero policies, either current jobs or potential future jobs from projects in the pipeline. And I mean, that just means that communities are just going to be destroyed in regional Australia. So wealth creation absolutely should be the focus of governments and of opposition in regards to regional Australia. I think there are a lot of regional seats up for grabs in this election. Yeah, you got Leichhardt up in North Queensland. You've also got seats in WA like Bullwinkle. You've got seats in New South Wales as well, around that Wagga Wagga area with independents potentially. And you've got the Hunter, a lot of the seats in the Hunter Valley also up for grabs. And they need to focus on job creation and wealth creation through industries that are viable. A lot of the Future Made in Australia projects that they are trying to promote are not viable at all. If they wouldn't exist without the subsidies that the government are handing out willy-nilly for solar creation or for green hydrogen, for example. So I think that the wealth creation initiatives need to come from industries that we know can work, whether it be loosening restrictions on agriculture or allowing coal to continue or to expand, or opening up gas fields for us to help alleviate our energy issues and also to export into the market. So I think wealth creation does need to be issue number one. It can't just be throwing away money or promising to give money for specific projects or specific road initiatives. I mean, the government should be shoring up our infrastructure anyway. It shouldn't be a promise to just wag around in election season. The government should be announcing new exciting wealth creation initiatives, not just infrastructure development here and, as you said, Dutton's loan announcement there. It needs to be sort of this sustainable ability to create wealth, create jobs, and economically develop the regions, not just through public funding, but allowing private investment to flood in as well to sustainably bring up this growth.
Well, private investment flows in when you've laid the groundwork for economy to run properly. First by providing the infrastructure you need in roads and water and all that sort of stuff as a guaranteed given. So when the company comes to set up, there's not this lack of amenity and also essential services. So that's the first step. But the other thing is, we have a situation where I think just before Christmas, Albanese now announced $3 billion more for childcare. Well, guess what? In regional Australia, what's the point of, for most people, what's the point of childcare? We're in a lot of people in towns and areas that don't have a system of childcare from 6 in the morning to 6 at night or whatever. People look after in general, look after their own snot boxes like we did in our generation. So you're talking about giving, throwing $3 billion into that sector, but that money actually goes into the people who run the centres, the organisations, the companies, and that. They're the ones who are going to make all the gains. Parents not going to, none of that goes directly into the hands of the parents anyway. So that's not productive. People might say, "Oh, well, you get productive because people can go and work." Well, it's counterproductive because you still got to put all these people in at high pay to look after their snot boxes, and we don't get anything built. But if you look at Northern Australia, we've got 80% of the mainland's rainfall, and what's being done about it? Nothing. We've got the potential with water infrastructure to grow whatever we want, forever and ever. That is wealth creation. Pumping money into childcare is not wealth creation. And until there's some sort of focus on that, and I think here's one of the big issues where we've come a cropper with this in regards to the regions. The fact that the Nationals and the Liberals have become welded at the hip and are almost the difference isn't really recognisable. And we've seen things a little bit in regards to the last week or so when Dutton announced that he was reaffirm his commitment to net zero after Trump threw him a lifeline basically by opting out of the Paris. He could have stepped back and said, "Look, we need to review that," but he committed to it, and that's driven a wedge between some of the Nationals and their Liberal Party counterparts.
So I've never, from a logistical or political viewpoint, understood the commitment to net zero. I mean, because it's basically Labor/Green light. It's basically an admission that, yeah, the Greens and Labor, they're right about net zero, but we're just going to do it less. And they'll always do it less because Labor and the Greens can never be seen to be doing net zero green policies less than the coalition. So you are ceding that argument. You are ceding all arguments about jobs. You're ceding all arguments about economic output, and it is ceding all arguments about the wealth creation that has built this country over generations and generations. Australia was built off agriculture and it was built off reliable, cheap energy. And the commitment to net zero completely undermined that. And therefore, Australians have never had a real debate over the policy itself and the harm that it does to Australians. Because both major parties put their hand up and said, we're doing net zero at the last federal election, there has been no debate. Australians have had no vote on net zero as an election issue, even though that as a policy, it is pretty significant. It's very significant. It impacts what we can trade. It impacts the type of energy that we have in our grid, and it impacts the food that we will be able to grow. So I'm very concerned that they have decided to recommit to net zero. I don't understand why. Particularly because with Trump having the next 4 years affirming America as an anti-net zero, anti-climate change agreement nation, and them being the economic powerhouse that they are, they will trade with nations accordingly. So I don't understand why we are remaining out of lockstep with our most vital, one of our most vital trading partners, but also our most vital strategic partner in terms of geopolitical issues. So I'm very concerned about our continued persistence with the policy, and I hope that there is a shift regarding net zero. But I have my concerns about whether.
Well, there is definitely some grumblings in the National Party because we have got a few people there who have been outspoken about it for a long time, like Barnaby Joyce in New South Wales and Matt Canavan in Queensland. But the reaffirmation of the net zero policy and staying in Paris Treaty by Dutton really just validates all the policies of the ALP in regards to climate change, net zero, renewables and that, and commits us on the same path. There's no point of difference. So to people like myself, it will be find some, my first preference is going to go to someone who sort of at least, calls out net zero for what it is, a nation destroying suicide note, as Terry McCann often refers to it. And then filter down from there. So as I say, as we move on to this election, how do you think it would fare if the Liberals and the National Party couldn't, or there was an interpretation that there was a divide between them as they moved into election? You think that would harm their overall credentials with managing the economy and the political debate?
Well, I mean, during the Turnbull and Scott Morrison years, the Liberals really relied on the Nationals to hold their seats, and they did hold their seats in order to maintain government. So I don't think the Liberals would be able to form government without the Nationals, and I think it would hurt their ability to relate to regional Australia, which, I mean, as I said, as you said, is the heartland of Australian conservatism at the moment and mainstream Australian viewpoints. I don't see any divide occurring soon. I do think that the Nationals and the Liberals have been fairly united under the leadership of both Peter Dutton and also David Littleproud. For better or for worse, it's up for people to decide. But I think that it would most definitely harm the Liberals to maintain a relationship with regional Australia. Even though I hoped that the Nats would be more oppositional to net zero than they currently are. But if what you say is true and that there are murmurs occurring about a potential shift in its policy towards net zero, we can see how influential the Nationals are in the joint party room. It was them, obviously, who first came out against the voice to Parliament, and the Liberals, within a couple of months had followed suit as well, and were able to lead, particularly behind Jacinta Price, the no vote, and ultimately won the referendum against the yes vote and the government. So I do think the Nationals hold some sway over the general policy areas that the coalition lead into, and I think it would be a loss to both parties if they did split off.
As we move towards election, what do you think some of the policies should be in regards to addressing our economical situation, especially in regards to the rising debt level? And what should the general public be questioning in regards to these election promises? And should they take a step back themselves and think, well, maybe we have to temper some of our expectations as we move forward to allow the government of the day, or after the next election, to actually address and fix some of these problems?
Well, I think some of the issues that we should see pursued at the next election, obviously, the abandonment of net zero and a lot of the associated regulations and red tape that has come with it. The abandonment of the safeguard mechanism, which regulates the carbon emissions of various high emitting projects such as iron ore projects, nickel mines, gas fields, LNG ports and coal mines. We should see the abandonment of the transmission lines that we've seen basically invade farmland, particularly across New South Wales and Victoria. These new transmission lines are obviously put in to accommodate basically the new renewable grid. We should see the abandonment of those and allow farms to operate at their maximum capacity, and allow farmers who know their land better than anybody to not have some bureaucrat tell them and say, oh, this is free space and this is not. The transmission lines should be abandoned. That I understand that that's both a state and a federal issue, but the federal government could hold some sway there if they shifted policy. We should see, and we can put an arbitrary number on this, but like a 1% cut in spending per annum until the debt has been adequately paid off. And what voters should question with every promise that they get is the money that will be used to fund this promise going to be borrowed? Is it going to be from tax? Will my taxes have to increase to fund this particular promise? I mean, because so many people in Australia, I don't think are politically engaged. A lot of these questions remain unanswered. Because the candidates don't really have to answer them, because people don't think about these type of things. And I really think people should, because government spending is fueling underlying inflation, and a lot of the current regulatory policies and industrial relation policies that exist, as we've spoken about today, they do fund inflation as well. And inflation eats into your disposable income and lowers your quality of life. So the root question that people should be asking is, do we have to borrow this money? Will it increase the debt? Will it increase my taxes? And if the answer is no to all of them, then the next question is, what will be cut to pay for this? And if it's, public servants, it's like regulatory public servants will have to be cut to fund this, or that we have found waste in a particular government department to help fund for something that is important to the community, then okay. But I highly doubt that a party will come out and say those things, which is really disappointing.
I think the other thing we'll have to endure too is the leaders of the party turning up in each electorate with their member and promising things to each electorate, this and that or whatever. But I think one of the biggest things we've got to address in regards to the federal government is it's got to go back and stick to its core responsibilities as under the Constitution. Its job is not to provide funding or specifically target funding for netball courts or shower blocks or this bit of road here or there. Their job primarily is defence, immigration, biosecurity, and other things, communications and that. And that's what they should be getting elected on, not drops of money thrown in each elected. And I don't know how we ever go to police this, but we don't need a federal government to talk about education and that. It's not its responsibility. Yeah. I mean, the centralisation of the things to the federal governments, put its hand out for control of it, basically on the premises is we want this done and we'll give you this bag of money if you comply the states. But it was a state's responsibility. There's nothing that the federal government is taken over in regards to education and health that's improved the situation whatsoever. So, how do we sort of get the federal government into line in regards to, you look after what you're supposed to do and don't campaign on those things that aren't your responsibility. Campaign on your core requirements or obligation, which are things like defence. That's what we should be voting for our federal government to do.
No, yeah, absolutely. So at the IPA, we think that a way to sort of solve this and sort of re-establish competitive federalism within Australia is actually to give the states some income tax powers so they can set their own rates and be responsible for the money that they spend themselves instead of racking up huge debt. And then that would allow for the federal government to give up funding abilities for specific projects, for potholes and stuff like that, and give up portfolios such as education and health and a lot of the services that they provide that were actually supposed to be in the remit of the states. This would also help with the income tax burden that Australians currently feel. Australians is some of the most income tax burdened people in the OECD. And also it more or less funds about 50% of the budget, I'm pretty sure. I got that here.
Yeah, if not more. But yeah. Income tax was originally a state power. It was only handed over in World War II as a measure to sort of save Australia from the invasion type thing, and the states never got it back. That giving back the states income tax might be fairly difficult and complicated, the whole thing. But
Yes.
what the first priority is, get over this use of the Commonwealth government coercing the states and how much money they get back from their own wealth creation. Maybe that's an answer, but it seems that by controlling at least 90% of the government revenue, the federal government does coerce the states a fair bit in regards to doing and implementing what they want.
Yeah, and there's simply not what a federalist society is intended to do. The biggest benefit of federalism and having states is that the states can compete each other for internal migration, for investment. And that simply just doesn't occur if you have an overreaching federal government, which what we currently have. And I mean, it limits the ability for the states to economically succeed. And I mean, I do agree that giving back some income tax powers would be a difficult and complicated issue, and would probably be not supported by the states, might I add, because it would require extra work.
Yeah.
But I do think that it's at least in theory the right thing to do. How possible it is, I'm not sure. But you can always try and you can always advocate, I suppose.
I think the key is to go back to the core values of the Constitution, re-examine them. And if you really feel aggrieved with that, we'll try to put up a referendum to the people, but you'd probably get smacked anyway. But again, being from North Queensland, I'm a strong advocate of more states. I reckon 3 or 4 new states like North Queensland, Riverina, New England, and that would certainly make it more difficult for the Commonwealth to coerce us as much as they do, and especially when you've got mendicant states like Tasmania and South Australia that basically have to be given. Don't worry about Northern Queensland. I mean Northern Territory. That's just a complete basket case, but they have to be given so much more of the GST portion to keep their economies going. So I think that's in the Constitution. They're the sort of things we should be revisiting with some sort of constitutional convention or something, and to see where we fall. But look, we've gone over the hour. I'd just like to offer you the opportunity to give up a final wind-up as we head towards this election. And maybe you can even give them a bit of a tip in what you think who's got to triumph.
Well, I'm very concerned about, so with this federal election, I'm very concerned about the lack of substance in policies from both the government and the opposition. I do think that the opposition made a very wise choice to go pro-nuclear. I don't think, as much as I don't think net zero is a plausible option in regards to our economy and how we achieve wealth generation. In regard to energy security, net zero is only viable with nuclear. Although my obvious preference would be to abandon the net zero policy altogether and to also leave the Paris Climate Agreement. I'm hoping for a large reduction in government spending and an introduction to a real Department of Government Efficiency, as we've seen in the US. It was promising to see that Jacinta Price was given that shadow ministry, and I hope all the success goes with that. And ultimately, I'm hoping that the policies that come out after the election maximise economic prosperity, grows the economy sustainably, rejuvenates the private sector. But I have my doubts about how achievable all of this is. And as for a tip, I think it's going to be very close. I think it will be a minority government, and I think it'll be a coalition minority government. Just.
I think one thing we can agree on, but is there is definitely savings available in the government, and they would be have to be the first sort of target because you're not impacting on individuals, people getting upset by the public servants and that, just reducing that waste and surely, I mean, I think the federal government revenue, probably in the last 10, 15 years has almost doubled. I think I can go back probably 15, 20 years, and I think the whole revenue return for the federal government was only in the $200 billion. It's now well into the 500 billions and heading to six. So, they've just had bags of money coming in, but gee whiz, not very good at spending it.
Well, also with interest repayments only increasing, we're going to have to make savings to pay off those compulsory repayments. So the savings need to come regardless of who wins government. But I'm hoping those savings come quick, because otherwise those interest repayments will only grow and will only grow. And if they grow unsustainably, if they grow too high at an unsustainable rate, our credit rating as a nation will go lower. It'll be an unviable place to do business. And yeah, I really worry for the future regards to government spending and debt levels in the short and also the long to medium term.
I think the basic shout out will have to be like it was in the United States. Are you better off now than at the end of, before the last election? And do you expect to be under this current government? Do you expect to be better in 3.5 years' time or 3 years' time? So I think that's a pretty good catch call. It worked pretty well in the United States. I can't see why it can't work here.
No, I don't see why it can't work either. I do think that Dutton has an opportunity to reach out to Australians and make a real cost of living pitch to the electorate. I think people are screaming for real sustainable help in the cost of living and a reduction of inflation and just a decrease of prices altogether. There's a lot of ammo there. The government promised a 275 reduction in power bills. It obviously hasn't happened. And with inflation with inflation stagnating above the 2 to 3 range target, at least underlying inflation stagnating above that level, there's real ammunition to be thrown about the government's performance. Per capita recession, living standards getting lower. I mean, there's plenty of ammunition in that case. And for those reasons and similar reasons as in the US, that's why I think Dutton will win minority government at the next election.
Okay, Saxon, we'll leave it there. I want to thank you very much for your time. If you can just hold on, I'll just introduce next week's episode and have a quick chat offline before I let you go back to your desk.
Cool. Thank you.
If you enjoyed today's show, please like, share and subscribe to our Facebook page and subscribe to our YouTube channel. Next week, my guest will be Senior Counsel Greg McIntyre. Now, you probably haven't heard of Greg McIntyre much, but he was the actual lead solicitor in the Mabo case and actually represented Eddie Mabo and coordinated the gathering of evidence and also the direction of the trial. So we will speak with him in regards to the process, the outcomes and the precedents that the Mabo case delivered to Australia. So please join me next week. Thank you.